Okay, so we'll switch just for this talk to English. So I do hope that everybody will understand. I will introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce Scott Jenson. He has been doing user interface design and strategy planning for over 25 years. He worked at Apple, System 7, Newton, at the Apple Human Interface Guidelines. He was UX director of Symbian, VP of product design for Cognima, managed mobile UX for Google, and was the creative director of Frog Design in San Francisco. Scott returned to Google in November 12, 2013 to lead the physical web project. He's now working on future Android UX concepts. Well, we enjoyed that a lot during the workshop. As a battle-scared veteran of the software industry, Scott has shipped a consumer spreadsheet, been part of 2 Mac OS releases, 5 Newton product cycles, 4 commercial website revisions, designed 3 different mobile phones UIs, sworn at innumerable mobile browser, and has over 20 patents. So it's our pleasure to welcome Scott Jenson to the keynote opening ceremony. Thank you very much, Scott.
Okay, I got this. We're set. It's ready to go. Okay? Okay, can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Thank you very much for letting me speak in English. It makes my job much easier. I have a tendency to speak very rapidly, and I've been told if I speak at a normal rate, it might be okay. So please raise your hand if you think I'm going too fast. I would appreciate that. Okay, so this is a very unique talk. Sorry? So, this is a talk that I have not given very often. It's a very personal talk about something that I'm working with. It's effectively kind of a new technique that I'm using at my work, and I use this every day. And let me give you a little bit of background. We always see charts like this. I just made this one up. It's not accurate, but we always see this chart, right? How first there were mainframes, then there were mini computers, then there's desktops. There's always this new thing that's going to come along and change the whole pattern. But I think there's something very interesting from the UX design point of view. Actually, I almost forgot. This will keep me honest. I'll hit the timer. So we started off by having a command line interface, a CLI. And that was a good start. It represented the computational power of computers, but the UX wasn't very good. And then, of course, we had the original Macintosh, and of course, the Xerox Star. They came along. But as we got more and more power with desktops, we started then to experiment with portable devices. Very much a copy of the desktop. It had the same kind of menu structures. It even had command key shortcuts. So as we moved to mobile, we copied desktop. And then, of course, along came things like the Newton, which I was associated with that, so I'm proud of that. But it was more, of course, closer to a more pure implementation as we started to lose our preconceptions. And then, of course, came the iPhone, which was a much bigger, stronger thing. But the interesting question that came with all of this is, as we went from this desktop to mobile, it became much simpler. So the expressive power of the user interface was growing with PCs, and then it took this huge jump down for mobile, and that was considered good. It was for consumers, it was simpler. But people forget the original iPhone had no copy-paste. It has no files, no windows, and only in the very latest version of iOS 13 have they started to kind of have more files and more windows. It's like we took this big simplification and went, oops, and we're starting to add more back in again. And this raises, I think, lots of interesting questions, which is, what are we trying to do, and what is simple, and what is too simple? And if we are really honest, almost every mobile phone today is just this black rectangle that you tap. they're quite similar and they're quite limited. So this basically caused me to pause and question and say, we need to pause and reflect. What are we doing? And is the next big step another app? Is the only way to think about innovation to make more apps? And so we've gone back and we've started to question, instead of kind of having this telescope to say, we need to go to the moon or something, it's like, no, we should be having a microscope and we should be saying, what are we doing? What are these tiny little things? How do we improve what is happening? Because I think all of us will admit that while we use our phones all the time, if you have to send a very important email, you're going to open your laptop, right? There's just something more expressive about it. Now, for little emails, yes. But if you're sending a very important email, no, you will not do that on your phone. But why is that? What is the tension between these two? And why is mobile so simple? So, that kind of thinking led me to talk about video games. And I can see you, I can understand you kind of go, really? Video games? Why would you care about video games? Well, video games are clearly very big, and there's a lot of money behind them. There's a lot of esports that are going on. And so I can understand that you might think that I am being a bit silly. But I don't want to think about video games from the commercial point of view or from the entertainment point of view. I want to think more from the UX point of view. And I don't want to talk about gamification. Gamification is where you give people rewards and little stars and little accomplishments. That's good. This was talked about so much about 10 years ago. And there's many books on how to do this. This is well established. But now, because mobile phones are considered to be a little addictive and people are using their phones too much, I think it is very dangerous today to use gamifications. People use their phones enough. We don't need to be making them use it more. So I do not want to talk about gamification. That's a very old very concept. When I started doing this, I wanted to say, what is it about games that makes them interactive and responsive and easy to learn? And my first thing, when I started doing research, is, at least in English, the word that they use is juicy. And if you do research on good game design, the word juicy comes up all the time. So I've never heard that word before. It's a strange word. But the idea behind it is that every action gives you more back. So initially games were like asteroids. You'd shoot the laser and it'd go pew, and that was it. It was a little laser. And now you shoot and it's pew, and it's just this huge reaction. And so there's all sorts of animations and vibrations and things, and it's all about making the game extra responsive. And I'm like, I don't think that's what I'm looking for. That still feels more like gamification. The other problem I had is that when I first started this, I thought there was something there, but I was worried that the two worlds were so different. So games create tension. This is from Breath of the Wild. Has anybody played Breath of the Wild? I'm just curious. Okay, you guys are officially cool. Okay. The rest of you, not so cool. But anyway, but games create tension, right? You don't walk up to the monster and just go, boop. No, you have to really work hard at it. You might die. And yet, if you were to ask a UX designer, how would you create a user interface to kill a monster? Well, the really good UX designer would give you one button, beat monster, right? That's what UX does. UX removes all the tension, removes all the problems. It makes it very, very simple. So I'm like, there seems like a paradox here. How do we figure this out? So what I ended up doing is I found this book by this man by Ralph Koster. It turns out, I think this book is in Spanish, if you want to get it. I think it's a very good book, and it's about game design. He made the term is called game grammarian. It's the grammar of games. And it's a fun book. It's a very easy to read book. And it only talks about games. But it's a little bit like this book, if you know Understanding Comics. This was a comic about comics. And this is a book that tries to be a game about games. And I thought it was very, very interesting. So I was able to meet with Raf, and we had many meetings, about 10 different meetings, where I would read the book and we'd talk about it, and I tried to translate his principles into applications. And it was a very interesting thing because he had never thought about using his grammar for applications. So I was coming from the world of apps and he was coming from the world of games, and it was a very interesting collaboration. Initially, I thought we would write something a little bit like this book. This book was very popular in the 1970s. It was by Walt Disney, and it was all the techniques to make Disney animation, how the ball would squish and how Dumbo would walk, and it was just a big collection of technique about how to do animation. And I thought that that's what we would do. We'd come up with a whole series of techniques to make your design perfect. Well, I was completely wrong. So this talk is really my journey in being wrong over and over again. So I want to show you some of the assumptions. So my first assumption is games are full of cool tricks for us to copy. All we have to do is play good games, make a few notes, we just put those in our apps and we're done. No, that's not at all. The other one was I thought that games had this really interesting technique. I don't know if you've played ouch, that's a little loud. This is, let's see. Thank you. Sorry, I have too many games. Mario Kart. I think you play a lot of games. Yes, okay. So this is Mario Kart. I loved this one because it wasn't a graphical trick, it was a psychological trick. If you are far back, if you are losing, you get really good rewards. If you're at the front, you get really bad rewards. And it allows you to balance the game so that it's a little bit more even. I thought that was a very interesting trick. Or in Super Mario Odyssey, they have this thing called assist mode, which allows a much wider range of people to play the game. This could be for assistive technologies. And I thought, okay, these are all really good tricks. And Raf was this man I was talking to, Raf Koster. He said, no, these are all good. You can use these. But games are constantly changing. They're constantly innovating. It would be much better for you to understand how games work, how games come up with these ideas, than to just copy, because next year there'll be something new. The other assumption I had is that games are linear and plot-driven, and that they force ways so that you must go to this path, you must see this ladder, you must climb. You have no choice in the matter. So of course, they have a much easier time of it than applications do. I mean, what do? We have Microsoft Word, and we have 49 icons across the top. It's like, yeah, good luck, And whether it's a movie or whether it's with video games, this is all being used in such a way that there's all this plot. And his point was that, yes, of course, there's plot. This is entertainment after all. But he goes, games go much deeper than that. So there's a lot more to discuss than just the plot issue. And I'm like, okay. But you have to admit, people practice games. They work really hard. They die over and over and over again. They do so much more. In our world, the user wants to print a document, and they fail, and they walk away. They never use the application again. And at this, he just laughed at me. He said, are you kidding me? He says, most games fail, like most applications fail. He goes, the only reason these kids like to play over and over and over again is because the game is very well designed. I'm like, now we're getting somewhere. What is it about these games that make people want to try again? Is there something for us to learn? So the talk is about how great games are built. What is the techniques about that? So in his book, he has about 25 things that he talks about. And I am only going to focus on these 6. And I'm going to go through each one of these in order that talks about how games are designed, because I think they're the ones that are most useful to us. And the warning, of course, is that games are not the same as applications, of course. So we have to keep in mind, but I do think that if we look really hard, we can find some inspiration, because the goal here really is not to create a checklist, but to kind of think differently. How can we break out of our established thinking? We just assume that we have a toolkit for mobiles or a toolkit for desktop, and that's a given. And then we just have to build on top of it. This is about going down and rediscovering some of those lower level techniques. This is why I speak at universities. I don't want to teach techniques to make new apps. I want to discuss new techniques to change the way we tap, to change the way we drag, change the way we pinch. These are deeper level research topics that need to be explored. So, story versus narrative. This is a game that is from Denmark that was based on, it was Limbo, I think was the first one, and then, do you know the second one? You remember that? So I thought you would save me on that one, okay. But anyway, this is a lovely game. It was an initial called Limbo. But the initial point that Raf wanted to make was that games present a story and players create narrative. And I'm like, those words are very similar. I don't think there's a big difference between story and narrative. And he goes, no, there's a big difference. I'm like, and the difference is that, in effect, the story is what the game designer gives to you. This is what I want you to do. The narrative is the user's journey. And anybody who has done user testing knows this, right? This is the arc of the things I want you to do. But what does the user do? They just go all over the place, right? Users go here, they go there, they go, no, why are you going there? Don't go there. They just do that. And then on top of that, they then tell a story afterwards. That's the narrative. And to me, this represents the classic tension between what we think the user should do and what the user actually does. And it's far more simple than user testing, though. Users create something between the features. If we don't give a user a story, they make up a story. Users always make stories. And that's the part that games understand really well. And the way he talked about this was in the levels of structure. So when you have something like a movie, there's a lot of story there. You just sit back and you absorb the movie, right? Really good movies, though, have ambiguous stories. So you have to think more, you have to talk. Like the Terminator movies are not very interesting because the good guy always wins, right? And the bad guys always fail. But the more nuanced movies make you think, like, what happened? Now, the difference, though, is that in a movie, the story that you tell is the interpretation, whereas in a video game, you have choices so that you're more engaged, you can do more things. But even something like Disneyland is a story. There are stories there, there's places for you to discover, and it's your physical interaction that becomes your narrative that you tell afterwards. And even sports, which has no story, it just has a couple simple rules. If someone watches a football match, of course there's a story to tell, because it's not just the football match, it's the history and the players and how they work together. We will always create a story afterwards. And so it's this kind of expanding aspect of how people want to have more choice and more story depending on what the structure is. So the point that games do is that games deeply understand this. And I don't think application designers do. We're kind of like, here are your features, have fun. Okay, and games are like, no, let's go on a journey. Let's figure this out. And I thought that was a very powerful insight, that games try to fill that void. They try to help you understand the story. So it's not the story, it's the arc. So the example I would say is that we as application people, as technical people, we always think in terms of features. Do you have feature A? Do you have feature B? Do you have feature C? So it's all about a higher level system. So let me give you an example. The original Macintosh back in 1984, now this is a long time ago, I realize, but I was there. It shows you how old I am. But back then, computers had a switch, and you would turn it on, and it would go bing, and it would just show you this black screen, right? And that was the original, and it was all about the capabilities. The Mac decided to tell a bigger story, so that when you turned on the screen, it would show you this, because it took 3 minutes to boot a Macintosh. I mean, that's how bad computers were in 1984. But the point of this screen isn't to just simply wait. This screen is a promise. This is what is coming, because after 3 minutes, you would have the same background, and then, Oh, I'm sorry, this is in comparison, of course, to what would happen with a PC. It would hide all of the scrolling and the things that were happening behind. But after the booting was done, the title bar came down. And it's like, oh, this is what you were about to give me. And so it says, we are going to give you this space, so just hang on, it's coming. But it was more than just simply saying, here's your journey. It went into little details, like this little corner up here. It seems a little crazy here, but if I make the background black, you can see what it does. It rounds the edges. It just makes it softer and more pleasant. It was meant to reflect those desktop leather topping you put on your desk for writing. It was meant to simulate that. Back in 1984, more people had desks that they used, but we don't do desks as much anymore. But the point is, it was trying to simulate this physical environment. And then, of course, the trash can would get wide, so it would do that. So the whole idea is that the Mac was not saying, hey, you're turning on a computer, let's go on a journey. And it was kind of this promise. And this really helped people feel that the machine was kind of on their side. They could trust it. They could see what they were doing. So this is, I think, is a brilliant example of using a story to create a narrative in the user's mind. So our story isn't the user's narrative. Apps usually think only in terms of features. Users will always build a narrative, so let's help them build a narrative. Games work hard to build story by creating reinforcing actions that make the story easy to discover. I thought this was very interesting. And so the example, of course, it was just the Macintosh I just gave you here. Well, let me give you another example here. Here is PayPal, a very boring web page. Here is their homepage. I took this literally 2 days ago. What is their journey here? Oh, are you a business or are you a person? You are the hero. Here's your first choice. Which one are you? Oh, if you're a business, here are the things that you might want to do. Do you want to do those? Or are you a person? And if you're a person, what things do you want to do here? And once you actually then make that choice, let's go back, it's like, okay, fine, here you go. Start your journey. It's not 17 things. It's like, who are you? Red pill, blue pill. It's like, what do you want to do? And then once you choose, then off you go. So this is a very simple example of exactly the same thing. And I think it's a very powerful way to start to get people to think about your product. Let me pause. Can you hear me okay? Everything good? Am I speaking too fast? Good. Okay, thanks. Okay, so we've done story narrative. Now let's go with games or fractal. The idea here is we use the old game Frogger. Hopefully people know the game Frogger. It's a very old game, right? The reason why RAF uses this as an example is that in one page, it shows this idea that games are made of games. So you think the game is just simply, oh, here's your frog, get up here. But no, there's actually multiple levels of games. There's this safe zone here, where you can move all you want to, and you won't die, and you can learn how to use the joystick, and you can go back and forth. And then, after that, you can cross the traffic, which is a certain level of difficulty, and then you have another safe zone, and then you have this moving river, which is more difficult, and then you have the extra game of being able to jump into these things because these logs are always moving in the same direction. So getting this one is easy, getting this one is really hard. And so it's like these levels. Now, at first when he showed this to me, I'm like, well, this isn't fractal, this is linear. And he goes, no, it's not linear, it's fractal, because yes, this is a way of breaking it down, but to cross the street, the game, of course, is to win the level. The sub-game is to cross the street. The sub-game is to move the frog. And if you really want to get down to it, the sub-game is to understand the joystick timing, because when you are moving the joystick, the frog doesn't respond instantly. You can't go forward and backward. You have to go and then let it move and then go back. There's a lot of feedback that you have to learn to figure out, because if you could move the frog instantly, you would win the game. It would be really easy. The frog is actually hard to move. That's part of the game. And so they understand that each level of these things, each of these levels has their own game issues. They have motivation, they have feedback, they have learning, and it's all about understanding this breakdown, piece, that I find to be really fascinating. So what we do as application developers is we stay very high. We always use the latest guidelines, the latest toolkit, and we never touch the bottom, and we try to be as consistent as we possibly can. That's good if you're doing a banking application, right? If you're not doing anything creative, use guidelines. But if we want to reinvent, if we want to go down deep, if we want to understand something new, we have to kind of do it rigorously, unpack everything. So games are fractal. It's not just a feature, but a reinforcing cascade of nested subtasks. So let me give you an example here. So here's Google Maps and BWAP. I don't know if you can see that's my, I'm doing a pinch to zoom. That's my finger, that's my finger. So in a sense, you can think of pinch as just being a simple gesture. But it's really a compound gesture because pinch is one level, but if I take off my thumb, it's still a drag gesture. And if I take off my finger, it's a tap gesture. So even something as basic as a pinch can be broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. And this is what I find really interesting. It gives us the motivation to really take things apart at a fine granularity. So now let's talk about the learning loop. This is original Super Mario Brothers, where, again, classic old game. Many of us have played this as we grew up. But again, what was interesting is that it's deeply based on the psychological idea of intent, action, and result. And in psychology, they often have a mental model, an affordance, and feedback. You think you know what's happening, you try something, you see the result, and you kind of go, oh, I'll try something else. This is a classic way in which you learn something, is through effectively this feedback loop. But what I loved what Raf was saying in his book is that fun is just another word for learning. And games deeply know this. They're not in the entertainment business, they're in the learning business. And I'm like, wait a second, so are we. We're doing the exact same thing. I thought that was very interesting. So what happens in Super Mario Brothers is, again, they have this breakdown. So you have this safe zone. You start over here, and all you do is you just move Mario back and forth. There's no monsters, it's completely safe. It's very boring, of course, but you're starting, you're learning how it goes. And then you learn the jump button. And when you first jump, you don't make it here. You just jump and you go bonk, bonk, and you hit it. And eventually, you press the button, and then you get on top. I can escape. This is your first game, is to escape that zone. And then you get into the area where you've got the bricks on top. And as you jump, they make it so that it's very easy for you to accidentally bump into that, and then you get that mushroom that makes you super powerful, right? And then you kind of go, oh, wait a second, jumping has an action. I can bump into things. And then finally, when you see your first monster, you're like, oh, wait a second, I can jump. I can jump in multiple ways, and I bet I can jump on this person. And of course, you jump on him, and you get the monster. So if they would show you this thing right away, you'd run in and you'd die. But by having all of this structure ahead of time, they've kind of set you up to succeed. I think this is really brilliant design. So, and what we would do as designers is we'd say, oh, you can move, you can open, and you can attack. And we would have 3 separate icons for each one, right? Because we think of it in terms of features. And like, no, it's just jumping. And jumping can do all the things that we would have 3 separate icons for. So, it's the same basic mechanic. And I think this is what I found most powerful, is that they really try to have one mechanic that they use in many, many ways. And so here's the quote I have from Miyamoto-san. He's one of the most famous game designers ever. And excuse me for reading this, but I think this is a really good quote. He goes, "That's how we make games at Nintendo. We get the fundamentals solid first. Then do as much with that core concept as our time and ambition will allow." So they work on jump, 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 and that's all they really work on, all the different ways of jumping. As for the courses and the enemies, the game, those actually come at the very end. They were just done in a single burst of energy, just thrown together almost. And this was like, wow. What I think of as the game is something they just put together over a weekend. And because they worked so hard at the concepts, they had a very rich toolkit. that made me wonder why the way we build applications, maybe we should be spending our time working on the fundamentals most of the time and then throw the rest of the application together. Because this, in a sense, enables what's called chunking. If you teach it right, you are teaching the user to jump and to grab and to attack, but if you do it right, they just say, oh, I'm just jumping. This is easy. If I hold the button a little longer, I jump farther. If I jump early enough, I land on the monster. So I'm doing many different types of jumping, but I'm just jumping. And that makes the user feel that the application is simple, and it's easy, and it's fun. And we would be saying, well, click on this button, and then click on this icon, and then we would be making it very complicated for the user. And of course, Nintendo does this all the time. They are the king of this. Super Mario Odyssey has many different ways in which you can jump. You can throw the hat, and you can jump on the hat. Splatoon is all about paint, and so if you paint on the ground, you can go into the paint, and then you can pop up. If you want to climb a wall, you paint the wall, and you do the same thing. So they always do crazy actions with one simple mechanic. So we always think about it in terms of multiple mechanics. Games have a single mechanic. Now, this might be hard for us to do at all. I'm just looking for inspiration at this point. And this idea of having one mechanic, I think, is a very strong inspiration. So learning loops create a shared mechanic, makes it not only fun, but allows users to learn advanced skills more easily. So here's the example. I was amazed. Back in 1984, when the Mac came out, there was this game that would teach you how to move the mouse. I forgot all about it. And I thought it was so poetic that here I am studying games to help me design mobile phones, and the original desktop systems shipped games to teach people these things. And what it was trying to do was to actually teach you a very interesting mechanic, which was effectively the mouse. And the mouse is effectively a single mechanic with many different loops. So yes, you can move the mouse, you can click the mouse, you can drag the mouse, you can shift click, right click. There's all these very rich things. And all of a sudden this little light bulb went on, and I was mentioning, well, geez, desktop has so much more richness than mobile. And then Raf was like, yeah, duh. You're like, this is a surprise. To him, this was obvious, right? Desktop has better loops than mobile. What does mobile have? Tap, pinch, drag, and if you really want to do it, you press and hold, right? So, and all of a sudden I started to understand why, when I wanted to write that very important email, I go to my desktop. Because with these gestures, I can edit much more elegantly on the desktop than I can on mobile. And now I understand why I want to use the desktop when I have to do something important. As a flip side, if people remember the force press on iOS, this has been out for about 3 years. And it was a way for you to press hard on the screen and you get a different menu. But I would argue, and by the way, Apple just announced that they're removing it. It's not a success. I don't want to criticize Apple. I work for Google. I'm not trying to make fun of them, but I think this is an interesting example because I would argue they didn't have a clear loop. When do you tap and hold, and when do you force press? And they each did different things. So from the user's point of view, they couldn't make a clean loop. It wasn't clear when they did it, and users were confused. So it wasn't a well-structured loop, so it wasn't used, developers didn't use it, and now they're taking it out. So now we've covered the first three things. These first three, I would argue, are about taking the problem and breaking it down. The next three are about building it back up again. So, affordances and feedback. I'm going to go back to Breath of the Wild. If you haven't played Breath of the Wild, please borrow one from a friend and just play the first 30 minutes. It's really spectacular. Just 30 minutes. I'm pretty sure if you played for 30 minutes, you may play it for 4 days because it's slightly addicting, but it's a really good game. But anyway, it has this idea of a stamina wheel. So if you're climbing, the little wheel goes down, and if it hits 0, then you fall. And as you advance, you can get more stamina. But the fascinating thing about it is that they do work really hard to give you feedback as to what is happening. A simple person would just say, oh, you climb, stamina goes down, and you're done. No. What happens is that this is a steep part of the rock, and this is a much flatter part of the rock. So what happens is that you use up the stamina faster this direction and slower this direction. But how do they communicate that? Well, when you stop climbing, you lean back so that you relax and the wheel stops. If you climb a steep section, you lean in and sweat starts popping out and the wheel goes on faster. If you go up this direction over here, the sweat stops and you lean back a little bit more and the wheel goes down slower. So they're effectively teaching you about the second derivative of a function using animation and feedback. I find that fascinating because I actually played this game and I learned to climb the easier routes and I didn't even know that they were doing this to me. This is like Jedi mind trick magic, right? They're teaching you something and you don't know you're learning. I just thought this was amazing. And I only knew this after I talked to Raf and he told me what they were doing. And I thought this was amazing, that they could give you this multivariable feedback in a way that was just effortless. But the same thing happens in many kinds of games. So in almost every video game, when you walk up to an object, this little take button will show up. And you see this thing, you'll probably see this 10,000 times. I'm amazed that we don't get irritated by this. Or in the fact that in Arkham Asylum, Batman has a grappling gun that he can throw a rope and he can swing. And as you get close to it, this little prompt shows up. The RB is the trigger button here. And it shows up. So these are things that you already know. You know how to pick up an object. You know how to use the grappling gun. You've already learned it, and yet they are giving you these things to say, yep, this is how you do it, this is how you do it. And so this is the really interesting aspect of this, that they are showing you things that you already know. In the case of fighting, if you do a dodge at just the right point, you can do a special attack. And they always signal the dodge by having the sword go wide so that you know when to dodge. Or when you want to find a treasure, this is a solid wall. This wall has little cracks in it. And so you know that if you put a little bomb there, you will find a treasure chest. So again, they have action affordances and they have visual affordances. This, of course, is what Android does. Hey, read something. Doesn't this seem really, really bad compared to what I just showed you? This is the only tool we have. Hey, I'm going to tell you something. Get out of here. Cancel. Who wants to do that? So the two worlds could not be more different. Boring and really interesting, right? Now, Raf has a gigantic spreadsheet of all these things. This is all in the book, so I can't go through all of it. But I wanted to give an example of just 5 of the types of feedback he says are used in games. The first is ambient feedback. This is very subtle, but it's the idea that whether you're walking in snow or you're walking in a dungeon or you're walking outside, the sounds are always different. The footsteps are different. And that really gives you a sense of ambience of where you are. But at the same time, there's multiple variable feedback. So as you're running, there's how quickly you're turning, how fast you're going, how quickly you're jumping. There's all sorts of things that are happening, and they take that very seriously. So, for example, there's a little smoke cloud that goes behind you. But what's interesting about the smoke cloud is because it leaves a trail, it tells you how quickly you're turning, and it lets you know, if you get to be more experienced, if you can make a corner or not. It's a very important feedback loop. When Mario gets a certain speed, his hands fly out. And some jumps need him to go a certain speed, and so you wait until his hands go out, and then you jump. They really take this idea of feedback very seriously. And so I would argue we could do the same discussion, which is what kind of feedback do we want to do for scrolling speed, or inertia, or finger pressure, or flick speed, or if you're dragging objects, do you want them to be attracted? Let's say if I'm dragging icons, should folders act differently than other icons? Should other icons repel a little bit, and should folders suck you in? This is what a game designer would think. And what do? We just drag the icon. Good luck. And if you go into something, oh yeah, okay, we'll highlight it. So I would argue that a game designer would work much harder at giving feedback. So here's a good example of this, though. Sonic Finder by Bill Gaver is a paper that was done around 1990 that tried to use sound for ambient feedback. And when you would click on an icon, it would just go tick. But if you clicked on a movie file that was 400 megabytes, it would go thunk. And so it used sound to give you a rough idea of the size of the object. And he had other sound things as well, which I thought was really fascinating. Now, again, this may not be the right direction, but this is a game-inspired idea of providing ambient feedback. So the other issue they have is about matching reality. So does the control, and here's where games have an awful lot of control. They can use the trigger button, they can use the actual switches, and what, of course, in mobile, all we really have is just simply tap and pinch and press and hold. And this is where I'm going to sound a little bit like an old man, but I think long press is a total hack. And so many applications require long press because we don't have much richness with mobile. And to me, this is a research topic right here. How do we provide more richness with mobile devices? This is a challenge to you guys, okay? But I would argue games would look at that as an opportunity. So is that really all we have? So this is the kind of thinking that this game work has prompted in me, and I'm experimenting with things like this at my work. So the other aspect of games I found really interesting is how they mix different graphical styles. So this is a game called Horizon Zero Dawn, another really good game I recommend, and it's effectively about a primitive society that has, in a apocalyptic world, a primitive tribe that has advanced technology. So anything about the person is effectively very crude and rough, and it kind of looks like cave paintings. But anything that's high-tech is very crisp and sharp, and it kind of really calls these two things out. The same thing happens with Mario. Mario, all the good characters are round and soft, and all the bad characters are hard and sharp. And you'd think this is just a little bit silly, but if we were to do a better version of navigation, this is using Google's material design. And yes, we have a title bar, but we have, in a sense, a nav bar that in many ways looks exactly the same as the content bar. I think that's a huge missed opportunity. I would argue that this needs to have a much stronger sense of feedback to let you know that this is somehow tied to the title bar. And it could be nothing more than a simple, small background. But using color and feedback and visual styles to reflect the structure of your document or your application strikes me as a very rich topic for us to explore. Now the last one is just fun. It's called grace notes, which is this idea that games want you to know this. So then when you walk up to a light switch, you go, hey, let me try the light switch. And sure enough, the light switch works. And it's a little bit like Mario and the bricks, and then when you bump into it, it's teaching you your loops. So grace notes are about doing things that don't matter at all. Now, I don't know how much we would use that as an application design, but it strikes me as we should have that energy to put random fun things into our projects. So, remember that list of tricks I wanted to avoid? Well, this is probably where you would find most of the tricks. But Raph had a really good point. He said, it's not the flashy trick that matters, but the rigorous application of multiple types of feedback, both important and in trivial ways. And I'm like, that's really powerful. So this is how I'm thinking about really microscopically tiny things in my work with text editing and keyboards and haptics. How do we take these things apart and have multiple levels of feedback that all kind of hook together again? So, at Google, we should be looking further at copying the status quo, but new techniques. So, in a way to summarize this is that we are afraid of prompting. We think that we should prompt the user one time, and then we're done. Games prompt constantly, and you know what? They get away with it. We like it. And I'm like really surprised by this. We should be thinking about how games can prompt, and why can't we prompt more often too? So affordances aren't all or nothing. There's a range of direct and subtle clues that are used many, many times and used repetitively. But the tricky thing I like is how Raph made a distinction between affordances and hintiness. And there's a difference there. The hintiness in a game, this is again Breath of the Wild. I really like Breath of the Wild, I'm sorry. But it's a really good game. But anyway, hintiness, this is a point where you have to go to this very dark forest and you have to figure out how to get through it. And you have a torch and there's a hint. I don't want to give it away, but you need the torch to figure out which way to go. And it's about making you pay attention and looking for better ways of going. And Raph was very important to point out that affordances are not the same as hintiness. And I was a little confused. You're still telling the user something, you're still showing, he goes, no, there's a big difference. The idea is that affordances reinforce the loop that you're on. You use affordances to say, you know this, I'm going to keep showing it to you so that you know it, and I'm going to keep showing over and over and over again. Hints move you to a new loop. And this is very important, and it's not clippy. Clippy is irritating. Everybody hates clippy, right? This is about subtle ways of getting you to a new location. So one example is in Disney, Disney has a famous term that nobody really uses anymore called weenies. Weenies is a very old word from the 1950s that means hot dog. And he would use a hot dog to get his dog to leave one room and go to the next. So that was where he used the word hot dog, or weenies, but he used it in the design of Disneyland. Every land that you're in can always see a big thing in another land. It's always a way out. It's a direction for you to go. And he called these big physical structures weenies, which is, I think, a terrible word. But anyway, so it was always a guide for you. And it was critical when they designed Disneyland that there was always one visible weenie. I never knew this before. In the same time, games have these things, like in Super Mario Odyssey, called moon chains. This is a moon that you want to get to. Now, first, you have to beat this boss. But then okay, I'll go there next. And so moons kind of give you this, okay, where do I want to keep going? And they have a rule in this game that every time you get one of these moons, if you look around, you can always see another one. And it always gives you this direction of where you should be going. It's a very powerful technique. And the reason why this is so important, this is an example from World of Warcraft. The classic problem that games have is that users get really good at one loop, and so that they're really good at killing spiders. Okay, they kill spiders all the time. And then they go to the next room, and there's an alligator. And they try to kill the alligator, and wham! The alligator kills them. They gotta go, I'm gonna go back to killing spiders, right? Because the alligator is too hard. Well, what happens is that they call that bottom feeding. You just do the same thing over and over and over again. And what happens in games is you get bored, and you quit the game. They really want you to kill alligators, and it's all about giving you that hint so that you can learn the next technique to kill the alligator. And we all see this when we talk to our friends and our family. When they use computers, they all use, the browser one particular way. They copy and paste one particular way. They've learned it, and they're never going to change. And we've seen all of our family do this as well. There's always this idea that I figured it out, and I'm done. And that, of course, is a problem because you can't grow, you can't get better. And we see this all the time in user testing that people are bottom feeding. So how can we use hintiness to kind of break out of that loop? And I don't think we think about that very often. We don't assume that our users are static. And how do we move them to the next level? So we tend to assume constant skill level. Games assume that hinting is the whole point. The whole idea is that you have to get users to learn something new. But of course, they're very sneaky. They use lots of hints. So here's a good example. In Photoshop or any other drawing program, you can have these guides. And there's a menu item called New Guide, and you put it in, and it just pops it there. And this is what a bottom-feeding person would do. They do this kind of over and over and over again. But eventually you learn that if you tap here and you can pull it over, you can drag it out. But there's absolutely no hint. You have to have someone else teach it to you. Well, that's one way. But what would happen is if every time that you did this, there'd be a small little ping animation and it slides out. It would take 100 milliseconds. It would not slow you down at all. If you did that, and the user may see it 50 times, but eventually they'd kind of go, oh, wait a second. Oh, right, okay, cool. So this is a simple example of how we could add hintiness to our applications to teach them, and the goal isn't to teach them right away, it's eventually to do it. And the final point is pacing. And again, this is Breath of the Wild, but games work really hard to tell a story, and there's that classic loop of exposition, complication, escalation. Every movie, every game all does this, but that's about doing games, and I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on the fact that games take the long view, and they work very hard on that first step. So remember this arc we talked about? they focus on this. What is the very, very first step that you have to take? Because that gets you going. So, it's a permission problem. So, I won't be able to play this video for you. Basically, it's Justice League, and it's the Flash. Has anybody seen the Justice League? It's a terrible movie. I'm sorry if you saw it. But, okay, if you've seen Justice League, the Flash is kind of a coward, and he's very scared, and they have a big battle, and he goes, what should I do? And Batman goes, just go in, go out, save one. And he goes, then what? You'll know what to do. And that's kind of it. Just go in, get one person, get back out, and you'll be fine. You'll figure it out. Just get in. So for us, the question is, what is that first thing? What is the thing to get started? So when we talk about examples, I'm stealing this from a talk by Luke Robuski. He's someone I work with at Google. And he talked about the fact that applications don't understand this. We've all seen this, right? Welcome to my game. Read a lot of text. What do? Next. Nobody ever reads this stuff. It's just too much. But the app doesn't understand. Whereas what they actually found was better, this was some financial application. They realized that people needed to create their first expense. Once they created an expense, everything came into place. So they got rid of all of those choices and just had a very, very simple get started button. And once they did that, the app transformed. So here's a good example of just finding the right first thing to do. Now, this is hard. It takes research, user research, but giving that user that first step is a very powerful thing. So what do? We say, here's our toolbox, have fun. What do games do? Do this first. So, in a sense, what I wanted to do is, so here's the 6 things I talked about, and I'd rather really organize them this way, because this is about taking whatever you're working on and breaking it down, and affordances, hintiness, and pacing is about building it back up again. And I think this is very powerful, because in a sense, the story versus narrative means think in arcs. What is the user trying to do? Give them a story. Help them get started. Games are fractal. Take a big object, break it down into small objects. Learning loop. Come up with your core mechanic. What is the one thing that you have to do? And then once you have that core mechanic, prompt the known loops. Make sure they don't forget it. Go over and over and over again. But use hintiness to move to new loops. Get them to the new ones. And of course, when you very, very first start the game, have a very clear call to action. This, to me, is a very powerful thing and a very strong way of taking a look at it. But the question then is, okay, well, what does this really mean for us? Whenever I talk about this, people often will look at it and they'll say, oh, okay, I'm going to redo my website this way. I'm going to redo my application this way. You can do that, and that's a pretty good thing to do. I'm speaking to communities like this because I want to prompt and discuss research. Let's think bigger. Let's kind of really reinvent what it means to be interactive. So what I do with my work is we take a microscope, take a look at the phone, and to really say, okay, what are the loops? What are the tiny pieces? I'd love to share with you some of my work, but we haven't quite shipped it yet. But what I can tell you about is we're talking about things like, what does it mean to scroll? What does it mean to tap? What does it mean to edit text? And we're deconstructing these things in very deep ways, and we're just getting started. And there's so much here, but why I like to come to conferences like this is to say, I think that the research community could be doing this as well, and I'd like to talk about that and explore ways in which we could uncover deeper, more precise, interesting loops. So I want to say thank you very much. I'll be here the rest of the day. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Some water, so I will use this and you can stay here. We have still some minutes, some more minutes for questions. So if anybody in the audience wants to ask something to Scott.
Let me ask in Spanish.
You can ask in Spanish as well, slowly.
Yeah.
Hi, John Alexis Guerra from Northeastern, you know. Thank you very much. That was an amazing talk. And I think you're in the right place to be doing this work, because one of the things I wanted to highlight is that Like when you think about web development or app development, there have been many milestones in which like you can see how things have improved because people like Google or Apple have released things like, for instance, Google Fonts. I teach web development. And we all knew that having a good font on your website was crucial, but it was so difficult to get a good font. And then came Google Fonts. And then with that, it's so easy now that it's even, there's no excuses anymore. So same goes, for instance, with accessibility, something else I work on. I also applaud the fact that Google shipped Lighthouse with the audits for accessibility. That was a great step forward. So it seems to me, and the question is, are you thinking on moving your research into something that could help developers provide better hinting, better affordances? Because, for instance, the example you gave for Illustrator, that sounds so good, but I have no idea how to do that as a developer.
So, to summarize the question, I would argue is that if we were to do this, would we be able to make this more accessible to developers? I think right now, this is very fresh. I only talked to Raf like 6 months ago, right? So we are just starting to do this research right now. I think the first thing to do is to discover what's important, and then it's to make an attempt at it and then provide tools. Absolutely agree with you. We have to have tools. We have to figure it out. So my guess is that we will probably, at least within my team, we will add improvements to Android, and then we will make those things that we add available as an API. But then, of course, it shouldn't just be Android. It should be, on the web, and it should be other things as well. And so I strongly agree with you. I just think it just takes time. That's all. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Scott. One more question? No questions? Oh, please.
And if anybody is shy right now, I will be outside later, so please come afterwards if you don't want to ask in front of a lot of people. That's okay too.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. First of all, I'm a big fan of Google Fonts, Pixel, and Nexus, and all that. And I wanted to ask you about these squeeze gestures. I think that's relevant to what you're talking right now. So, is that squeeze continuing forward? Has it failed? Is it adding richness? Will there be more variety to what we can do with our phones in that regard? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for your question. It's about the squeeze gesture. I can't comment on where it's going in the future because I have no control over that. All I can tell you is that I like the squeeze gesture, and what I really like with the squeeze gesture is that it actually has hintiness in it, and which was done before my research. So if you just squeeze a little bit, you'll actually see it, just tiny things show up that kind of give you that hint. So I would argue that the squeeze gesture is one of those gestures that does a lot of this kind of stuff. I do know that there was a lot of discussion on the team about what the squeeze gesture should do, because it can do so much more than just the assistant, and I think there's still a lot to be done there. That is a different group, so unfortunately I can't answer your question. I just don't know. But I agree that I think that there's a lot more that can do, and I get excited about what it could do. I just don't know. I'm sorry.
So thank you very much. On behalf of the program committee of the conference Iberoamericana Interacción Human-Computer Interaction, let me give you this a small present. This is the candies that I told you.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much.
The best of Mexico.
Thank you. Thank you.